So in that last video, I gave you a very small snippet of a recording of a slave. I strongly suggest that you go to external links where I've hooked you up with this and listen to some of these amazing recordings. I was exposed to this when I was in college, like 15 years ago, and getting my credential to teach. And one of the professors that I had actually had us listen to some of these recordings, and I was so enamored with the stories that they had to tell. Now, I am from the South, and I grew up on a farm, and I had some really interesting folks that I got to talk to when I was young that reminded me very much of some of these same people who were telling these stories as slaves. And so to me, it was deeply fascinating, but to go back into history and to listen to these people is a real gift. And so if you have the time and the interest, go back and check out a number of these recordings. They have some really interesting and amazing stories to tell. But we're going to move on from the minstrel show and talk about some of the later musicians that influenced our American popular music. The first one being Stephen Foster. Now, Stephen Foster actually wrote songs that were part of the minstrel show, and he became an extremely famous musician. Unfortunately, there was no such thing as copyright law during his lifetime, and so he actually didn't get a lot of credit for these songs. He had to kind of keep churning them out because he wasn't paid any sort of like royalties or anything for them. But what's interesting about Stephen Foster is I know you've heard Stephen Foster songs. As a matter of fact, when I was leaving the ballpark today, my daughter plays soccer. The ice cream truck was playing a Stephen Foster song. Oh, Susanna, actually right here. But we're actually going to be listening to something a little bit different. But one of the things I want you to think about with Stephen Foster is I've talked a couple of times now about something called a hook. And he's actually the first musician to develop this idea that he's going to create a catchy little melody that's going to help you remember. When Stephen Foster was writing these songs, remember, there was no way to record anything, so the audience had to remember the tune to go by the song. So this was his way of catching the interest of the listener so that that person would then want to go learn the music and sing the song, and that's how he would then make money off of the song. So this is another one of my favorite artists, thinking Camptown Races. This is Johnny Cash. And we're just going to listen to a small amount of this. And this is probably Stephen Foster's most famous tune.
Camptown gals all sing this song. Doo-dah, doo-dah. Camptown racetrack 10 miles long. Oh, doo-dah day. 15 men on the Camptown track, doo-dah, doo-dah, trying to hold that bay horse back, oh, doo-dah day. Bound to run all night, bound to run all day. I bet my money on a bobtail nag, somebody bet on the bay. Well,
It's so hard to only talk about him for 3 minutes. He's so widely influential in our culture, but unfortunately we have so much to talk about. I have to move on. And the next important person we're going to talk about is John Philip Sousa. He was actually an important band leader. The band became an important tradition out of the Civil War. The Civil War had bands that would travel with the different armies. And after the war was over, the patriotism continued, and brass bands became kind of an inherent part of our culture. You know, if you ever listen to or go to a parade on the 4th of July, there's always a brass band there. And I've done many fireworks shows in my own career. So brass bands are still an important part of our American culture in the music today. John Philip Sousa became known as the March King In the late 19th century, he was the band leader for the U.S. Marines. You know, he's a very interesting man. He did form his own traveling bands, and he became the first artist to have royalties for his music. The first one to negotiate royalties. So that's really important to know that that's kind of, you know, one of the things that Stephen Foster had to deal with that was not good for him. And John Philip Sousa managed to change things for himself and the musicians in the future. We all know his music. Stars and Stripes Forever is the most famous piece that he wrote, and he became known as the March King because he actually composed over 135 marches. So let's take a quick listen to his music. Now you'll notice here for this band arrangement, there are no strings. That's the difference between a band or a wind ensemble and an orchestra. But there's also an orchestral version of this. But this is probably his most famous march. It's played countless times every year in the summertime when we celebrate our Independence Day. Now, as we near the end of Chapter 2, we're going to talk about Tin Pan Alley, which I'll be talking about throughout this semester. But Tin Pan Alley was 28th Street in New York City. Later it became known as the Brill Building, which we will revisit during the R&B era in the 1960s. But this was a special building that housed a bunch of musicians who were trying to come up with the latest, greatest song. When Tin Pan Alley came into prominence, it was unlike anything that had happened before. Yes, John Philip Sousa had some great marches, and yes, Stephen Foster had a bunch of great songs that were popular, but it was really this hit After the Ball that made people realize that there was a huge mass market, and this building was filled with composers trying to come up with the next big hit. So after they would write these songs in Tin Pan Alley in these pianos there, it was called Tin Pan Alley because there were so many pianos it sounded like a bunch of tin pans being banged around together. But after they would make their hits, so to speak, they would send them out to different department stores, and the department stores would hire someone called a song plugger, which was a piano player and a singer who could be called up at a moment's notice to play a piece of music for a customer, for that customer to decide whether or not he or she wanted to purchase the piece of music. It's kind of like going into Target and you go past that little kiosk that has the different CDs that you could listen to. You just punch a button and you listen to a CD. They probably don't even have it anymore, but I'm thinking about back in the days when I used to shop there. And you could listen to the song and decide, hey, do I like that song enough to purchase the CD? Well, there were no recordings at this time. Recordings were just kind of coming into being with the advent of the phonograph. So the song plugger became kind of the live phonograph. So they're the ones that were the salesmen of the music in Tin Pan Alley. From Tin Pan Alley grew vaudeville. Vaudeville was an outtake of the early minstrel show. Now, the biggest difference between vaudeville and the minstrel show is the minstrel show had a narrator and kind of a lead guy that brought the entire show together to give you kind of one theme, whereas vaudeville was just kind of a crazy group of acts. It could be anything. It could be actually like early silent films when that came to be. It could be musical numbers, animals, magicians, female impersonators, one-act plays. It could be pretty much anything. A lot of animal acts, acrobats, things like this. And so vaudeville was kind of this crazy show that would go on inside of a theater, and they would post their bills or their broadsides in front of the theater so that you would know who was going to be performing and when it was. And there were all these different genres. It was kind of a little bit of something for everyone. I have a very short clip of vaudeville, and you can see all the kind of different crazy acts that were in it at the time. The other thing is vaudeville actually promoted a number of artists that went on to be important early film stars as well. Vaudeville was really popular until the big stock market crash and the Great Depression happened, and then of course no one really had money for entertainment for a while. But vaudeville was really popular from say 1880 until 1930.
Still a main attraction, even where films were played. A lot of the small-time, four-a-day acts were routine but good. On the big time, you saw the great stars, like Harry Houdini, never equaled in his line.
So even in that very short clip, you could see all the different acts and things that might have occurred during the time of vaudeville. The song After the Ball by Charles Harris came out of vaudeville and was our first big popular hit. And so it became really important, this song, based upon the fact that it was kind of the first mass media sensation. It's actually your featured video of the week, and you can take a listen to it if you would like to. It is strophic, and it tells a really sweet and poignant story about a man who met a girl who he really liked, and he saw her kissing someone after the ball. But it actually was a very platonic thing, and she was actually meeting her brother. But it was a big misunderstanding, and because of that, he actually never married and spent his life alone. So it's a sad story, but one that is well told through this particular tune. So I would definitely suggest a listen on this. As we move on, I can't get out of the late 19th and early 20th century without talking about Scott Joplin. He was our first major African-American composer, and he was well known for his ragtime pieces. He actually made piano rolls that were put in player piano so the pianos could play on their own at that time. And so his music became really famous because of that. And there's a really classic piece that we've all heard that is kind of part of our culture. It's become a standard that Scott Joplin wrote. And I want to take a quick listen to that. So this is probably something that is familiar to most of you. And he was well known for his ragtime music, which actually, because of its syncopated or ragged rhythm, which is why it's called ragtime, became kind of the precursor to jazz music. So a lot of musicians were influenced by this music to go on and kind of make more of that idea of the ragged rhythm. And then finally in chapter 2, we talk about the phonograph, which was invented by Thomas Edison in 1877. It became a novelty, which then grew into actually 2 million households by the turn of the 20th century, actually into about 1910, 1920. So this is really how music became such a big facet of our everyday life. And we'll pick up with that in chapter 3.